Easter weekend, 1960. A small Texas town. A young schoolteacher, radiant and beloved, walks into a church for confession. She never walks out. 5 days later, her body is pulled from a canal, and the only person who saw her last? The priest who heard her final confession. For 57 years, this case sat in limbo, open wound in a community torn between faith and justice. The suspect wore a Roman collar. The evidence pointed one direction, but the institution protected its own. Decades passed. Witnesses died. Memories faded. But some truths refused to stay buried. This is the story of Irene Garza, a beauty queen whose murder became the oldest cold case ever solved in American history. It's a story about power, silence, and the agonizing wait for justice that spanned more than half a century. If you're intrigued by cases where justice takes decades to arrive, you're in the right place. Hit that like button, subscribe for more deep dives into true crime's most complex cases, and drop a comment telling us what you think about this one. Share this with anyone who loves a story where persistence finally pays off. Now, let's dive into a mystery that haunted an entire generation. In the spring of 1960, McAllen, Texas was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business. Situated in the Rio Grande Valley, just a stone's throw from the Mexican border, this small city embodied the tight-knit community values that defined mid-century America. The population hovered around 32,000, small enough that a familiar face greeted you at every corner, large enough to have its own sense of identity and pride. The streets were lined with palm trees that swayed in the warm Gulf breeze, and the downtown area bustled with local shops where proprietors knew their customers by name. It was a community bound together by tradition, family ties, and faith, particularly Catholic faith, which ran deep in this predominantly Hispanic region. Into this world, Irene Garza had been born and raised, and by all accounts, she had blossomed into everything a young woman of that era was supposed to be, and then some. At 25 years old, Irene wasn't just beautiful, though her beauty was undeniable. She had won the title of Miss All-South Texas Sweetheart in 1958, a crown that brought with it the kind of local celebrity status that turned heads wherever she went. But Irene was far more than a pretty face in a tiara. She possessed a warmth and intelligence that made people feel seen, heard, and valued. Former students would later recall how Miss Garza had a way of making even the most struggling child feel capable of greatness. She taught second grade at Hachar Elementary School, and her classroom was a place where kids actually wanted to be. That's a rare gift, the ability to inspire young minds while maintaining the discipline and structure that learning requires. Irene came from a respected family in McAllen. Her parents had worked hard to provide their children with opportunities, instilling values of faith, education, and community service. The Garza household was one where Sunday Mass wasn't optional, where education was seen as the pathway to a better life, and where reputation mattered. Irene had absorbed these lessons completely, becoming the kind of daughter that made parents beam with pride. She was devout in her Catholic faith, attending Sacred Heart Church regularly, participating in church activities, and taking her spiritual life seriously in a way that went beyond mere social obligation. For Irene, faith wasn't just about Sunday appearances, it was woven into the fabric of her daily existence. Those who knew her described a young woman with an infectious laugh, a generous spirit, and dreams that extended beyond the Rio Grande Valley. She had recently started dating, though by the standards of 1960, her romantic life remained appropriately modest and carefully chaperoned. Friends said she talked about eventually getting married, maybe having children of her own, continuing to teach and make a difference in young lives. She was the kind of person who seemed destined for a happy, fulfilling life, the American dream personified in a small Texas town. But perhaps what made Irene most beloved was her approachability despite her beauty queen status. She hadn't let the crown go to her head. She still shopped at the local grocery store, still attended community events without airs, still made time for friends and family regardless of how busy her teaching schedule became. In a world that was beginning to change, the civil rights movement was gaining momentum, Cold War tensions simmered, and traditional values were starting to be questioned. Irene represented stability, goodness, and hope. She was proof that you could be beautiful and intelligent, faithful and fun-loving, ambitious and humble all at once. The McAllen of 1960 was also a place where the Catholic Church held enormous influence. In Hispanic communities throughout South Texas, the church wasn't just a religious institution. It was the cornerstone of social life, moral authority, and community identity. Priests were revered figures, seen as direct representatives of God, men who had sacrificed normal lives of marriage and family to serve a higher calling. To question a priest was to question the church itself, and to question the church was nearly unthinkable for most families. The collar commanded automatic respect, automatic trust, and automatic deference. Parents entrusted their children to priests for religious education. Families confided their deepest secrets during confession. The faithful sought guidance on everything from marriage problems to financial decisions. This level of trust, this unquestioning reverence, created a protective shield around clergy that would prove tragically consequential. Sacred Heart Church stood as one of the most prominent buildings in McAllen, its architecture speaking to both faith and permanence. The church had served the community for decades, witnessing baptisms, first communions, weddings, and funerals that marked the passage of generations. Within its walls, the rituals of Catholicism played out daily: morning mass, evening vespers, and the sacrament of confession that allowed the faithful to unburden their sins and receive absolution. The confessional booths, with their dark wooden screens that separated priest from penitent, represented one of the most sacred spaces in Catholic tradition. What was said in confession stayed in confession, protected by the seal of the confessional that priests took extremely seriously. This sacred privacy, this guarantee of confidentiality, was fundamental to the sacrament. But it also meant that confessionals were places of profound vulnerability, where people, especially women, found themselves alone with a priest, trusting completely in his holiness and honor. In April of 1960, as Easter weekend approached, McAllen was preparing for one of the most important periods in the Christian calendar. Holy Week, the days leading up to Easter Sunday, involved special services, extra confession times, and a general heightening of religious observance. Good Friday and Holy Saturday were particularly significant, days when churches saw increased attendance and when the faithful made special efforts to cleanse their souls before celebrating Christ's resurrection. For someone as devout as Irene Garza, attending confession during Holy Week wasn't unusual. It was expected, a natural part of her spiritual discipline. The town itself was experiencing the particular energy that comes with spring in South Texas. After the mild winter months, the weather had turned warm but not yet oppressively hot. Flowers bloomed in yards and parks. Kids played outside until the streetlights came on. There was a sense of renewal in the air, that feeling of fresh starts and new possibilities that spring always brings. McAllen felt safe. Crime was relatively low. People left their doors unlocked. Children rode bikes freely through neighborhoods. The idea that something truly horrific could happen here, in this peaceful community, seemed almost absurd. Sure, there were the usual small-town dramas, gossip, minor scandals, the occasional teenager getting into trouble, but real violence, the kind that shattered lives and communities, that was something that happened elsewhere, in big cities, in places without the moral foundation that faith provided. Irene's life in April 1960 seemed to be on an upward trajectory. The school year was progressing well, her students were thriving, and she had plans for the summer ahead. She maintained close relationships with her family, particularly her parents, who still worried about their daughter the way parents always do, even when their children are responsible adults. Her social circle included other young teachers, fellow parishioners from Sacred Heart, and friends from her beauty pageant days. She was building the kind of life that seemed both admirable and enviable, rooted in community, guided by faith, and full of promise. The neighborhood where the Garza family lived reflected the modest prosperity of working-class Mexican-American families who had achieved stability through hard work and determination. Houses were well-maintained, yards were tidy, and neighbors looked out for one another. It was the kind of place where borrowed cups of sugar were common, where children played together across property lines, and where everyone noticed if something seemed off. The Garza home itself was a center of warmth and hospitality, a place where family gathered for meals and where laughter was frequent. Irene's room reflected her personality, neat and organized, with touches of femininity in the decor, photographs of loved ones, and probably a few books stacked on a nightstand. It was a room that expected her return every evening, a room that represented safety and belonging. As we look back at Irene Garza's life in those final days before everything changed, what emerges is a portrait of someone who represented the very best of her community. She had embraced the values she'd been raised with while also pursuing her own dreams and ambitions. She balanced tradition with modernity, faith with intellect, beauty with substance. In many ways, she embodied what the American 1950s and early 1960s held up as ideal womanhood: graceful, accomplished, moral, and devoted to both career and faith. But she was also more than just a product of her times. She was a real person with hopes and fears, strengths and vulnerabilities, a whole life ahead of her that she had every reason to believe would unfold beautifully. The tragedy of what was about to happen isn't just about a life cut short, though that alone is devastating enough. It's about the theft of all those unrealized possibilities, the children Irene might have raised, the students she might have inspired for decades to come, the love she might have shared, the wisdom she might have gained and passed on. It's about a family that would be forever fractured, a community that would lose its innocence, and a case that would expose uncomfortable truths about institutions and power and the ways that evil can hide behind respectability. But before we can understand the full weight of that tragedy, we need to understand who Irene Garza was. Not just a victim, not just a name in a cold case file, but a vibrant, accomplished, beloved young woman who had every right to expect a long and happy life. She was the girl who had everything, living in a town that felt safe, trusting in institutions that demanded trust, and looking forward to a future that should have been hers. That's what makes what happened next so particularly cruel, and so impossible for those who loved her to ever fully accept or understand. April 16th, 1960 was Holy Saturday, the day before Easter Sunday, and for Catholic families throughout McAllen, it was a day of quiet anticipation and spiritual preparation. The solemnity of Good Friday had passed, with its contemplation of Christ's crucifixion, and now the faithful waited for the joy of resurrection morning. But Holy Saturday wasn't just about waiting. It was about readiness, about ensuring your soul was prepared for the celebration ahead. For many Catholics, that meant going to confession, that sacred sacrament where sins were acknowledged, forgiveness was granted, and spiritual renewal was promised. Sacred Heart Church had extended confession hours during Holy Week to accommodate the increased number of parishioners who wanted to receive the sacrament, and Irene Garza had every intention of taking advantage of that opportunity. The day began normally enough for the Garza family. It was a Saturday, which meant Irene didn't have to teach, allowing for a more relaxed morning. Details of those early hours have been lost to time, but we can imagine a typical weekend morning, perhaps breakfast with family, maybe some household chores, possibly plans being discussed for Easter Sunday dinner. The Garza household, like many Catholic homes, would have been preparing for the holiday in both spiritual and practical ways. But as the afternoon approached, Irene mentioned to her family that she was planning to go to Sacred Heart Church for confession. This wasn't unusual or particularly noteworthy. Irene was a regular at confession, taking the sacrament seriously as part of her faith practice. Her family thought nothing of it when she prepared to leave the house that evening. According to later accounts, Irene left home around 7 p.m., though exact times would become a point of intense scrutiny as investigators tried to reconstruct her final hours. She drove her own car, a sign of the independence she enjoyed as a working woman with her own income. The drive to Sacred Heart Church from the Garza home wasn't long. McAllen was a small enough city that nothing was very far from anything else. As she drove through the familiar streets in the fading daylight, Irene had no reason to feel anything but peaceful anticipation. She was going to do something she'd done countless times before, in a place where she'd spent countless hours, to participate in a sacrament she'd received since childhood. Everything about this trip should have been routine, safe, and unremarkable. Sacred Heart Church in the evening hours would have had a particular atmosphere, quieter than Sunday mornings, with softer light filtering through the stained glass windows, creating that contemplative mood that churches seem to specialize in. The sanctuary probably wasn't crowded, as confession times could stretch across several hours, and people came and went according to their own schedules. The church interior, with its familiar Catholic iconography, statues of Mary and various saints, the crucified Christ above the altar, rows of wooden pews worn smooth by generations of the faithful, represented a space of complete safety in the minds of parishioners. This was literally God's house, and the men who served there were God's servants. What harm could possibly come to someone within these consecrated walls? The confession schedule that evening included Father John Feit, a young priest who had been assigned to Sacred Heart Church. At just 28 years old, Feit was relatively new to the priesthood, having been ordained only a few years earlier. He was a man of average height and build, with dark hair and features that wouldn't have stood out in a crowd. To the parishioners of Sacred Heart, he was simply Father Feit, another priest serving the community, hearing confessions, saying masses, and performing the various duties expected of clergy. Most people wouldn't have given him a second thought beyond the automatic respect afforded to anyone wearing a Roman collar. He was younger than many priests, perhaps a bit more awkward in his social interactions, but nothing about him screamed danger or set off alarm bells. That's the insidious thing about predators who hide within institutions. They often look exactly like everyone else, sometimes even better than everyone else, because they understand the importance of camouflage. Irene arrived at the church and made her way inside. Other parishioners were there as well, though not in great numbers. Several people would later recall seeing her that evening, providing crucial testimony about her presence and demeanor. She appeared completely normal, no signs of distress, no indication that anything was wrong or that she had any concerns about being there. She waited her turn for confession, probably praying quietly or reflecting on what she wanted to confess, engaging in the mental and spiritual preparation that the sacrament encouraged. When her turn came, she entered the confessional booth where Father Feit was hearing confessions. What happened inside that confessional is something only two people ever knew, and one of them would never have the chance to tell. The confessional booth was traditionally divided by a screen that allowed the penitent to kneel and speak to the priest without direct face-to-face contact, though some confessionals did allow for face-to-face confession if the penitent preferred. The booth was dark, private, and designed to facilitate honest acknowledgement of sins without the discomfort of direct eye contact. It was a space that required complete trust and vulnerability. Irene entered that space as she'd done many times before, expecting nothing more than to confess whatever sins weighed on her conscience, receive absolution, and be assigned penance, typically prayers to say or acts of charity to perform. It should have taken maybe 10 or 15 minutes, and then she would have left the confessional, said her penance prayers at one of the church pews, and driven home to her family. But Irene Garza never came out of that church, at least not alive and not under her own power. Somewhere between entering that confessional booth and the next morning when her family expected her home, something went catastrophically wrong. The timeline of that evening would become one of the most argued over aspects of the case, with investigators trying to piece together exactly what happened and when. Other parishioners who were at Sacred Heart that evening saw Irene arrive and enter the confessional. Some reported hearing unusual sounds. One witness claimed to have heard what might have been a woman's cry or grunt coming from the direction of the confessional area, but at the time, such sounds didn't register as alarming. Churches make all sorts of noises, and people might have dismissed whatever they heard as nothing significant. After all, this was a church, and Father Feit was a priest. What could possibly be wrong? At some point during the evening, a portable viewing screen used for religious education had been moved or was noticed in an unusual location. This detail would later become important, though its significance wasn't immediately clear. The church had various rooms and areas beyond the main sanctuary: offices, storage areas, classrooms for religious education, and other spaces that most parishioners never had reason to enter. Some of these areas would have been relatively isolated, particularly in the evening when only confession was taking place and the church wasn't bustling with activity. The layout of Sacred Heart Church, like many Catholic churches, involved multiple rooms and corridors, creating spaces where someone could be completely alone and unheard if they were in distress. When the confession hours ended that evening and the last parishioners departed, the church would have been locked up as usual. Father Feit would have completed whatever closing duties were required and presumably gone about his business. The church sat in darkness, and the streets of McAllen gradually emptied as families settled in for the night, preparing for Easter Sunday celebrations. In the Garza household, there might have been some mild concern when Irene wasn't home by the expected time, but perhaps not alarm. Not yet. Maybe they thought she'd stopped somewhere after church. Maybe she'd run into friends and was chatting. Maybe there was some perfectly innocent explanation for why she was running late. Parents worry, but they also try not to overreact, especially when their daughter is a responsible 25-year-old woman with her own car and her own life. But as the evening wore into night and there was still no sign of Irene, concern would have deepened into worry, and worry into fear. Phone calls might have been made to friends. Had anyone seen her? Was she with someone? Had she mentioned other plans? The answers that came back would have been increasingly alarming. No one had seen her since church. No one knew where she was. This wasn't like Irene. She wasn't the type to stay out late without letting her family know, especially not on the evening before Easter. By the time the night was truly late, the Garza family must have been frantic with fear, that particular terror that parents feel when their child is missing and no explanation makes sense. The Easter Saturday that should have been a peaceful preparation for joyful celebration had become the beginning of a nightmare. Somewhere in McAllen, Irene Garza was missing, and her last known location was a church confessional with Father John Feit. The innocence of that fact, going to confession, stood in stark contrast to the horror that was beginning to unfold. This was supposed to be one of the safest things a Catholic woman could do, visiting a church, speaking to a priest, participating in a sacred sacrament. The very idea that danger could lurk in such a place, that the priest himself could be a threat, was almost impossible to fathom for the Garza family and for the McAllen community that would soon learn of Irene's disappearance. As that long night dragged on, with no word from Irene and no explanation for her absence, the Garza family faced a situation that every parent dreads. Their daughter, their beautiful, responsible, beloved daughter, had simply vanished. She'd gone to church and never come home. The last person known to have seen her was a priest, a man of God, someone who should have been above suspicion. But as the hours ticked by and Easter Sunday dawned without Irene's return, even the most faithful families began to question everything they thought they knew. The protective shell of faith and community that had always made McAllen feel safe was beginning to crack, though no one yet understood the full extent of what had happened or the terrible truth that would eventually emerge. That Holy Saturday evening represents the last time Irene Garza was seen alive by anyone who cared about her well-being. Whatever happened in those hours between entering the church and the moment her family realized she wasn't coming home, it marked the point where an ordinary day became a tragedy, where a routine religious practice became the setting for a crime, and where the life of a vibrant young woman was stolen. The confession she went to give would never be completed in the way she intended, but the confessions that would eventually come, decades later, from unlikely sources, would finally provide some answers about what really happened on that Holy Saturday evening. For now, though, as Easter Sunday arrived in McAllen, all anyone knew was that Irene Garza was missing, and the search for her was about to begin in earnest. Easter Sunday morning, April 17, 1960, should have been a day of celebration throughout McAllen. Churches should have been filled with families in their finest clothes. Easter lilies should have adorned altars. Children should have been hunting for eggs in yards across the city, and the joy of resurrection should have infused the community with hope and renewal. But in the Garza household, and increasingly throughout Sacred Heart Parish and the wider McAllen community, Easter Sunday was marked not by celebration but by growing dread. Irene Garza had not come home, and now, in the bright light of day, her absence was impossible to dismiss or explain away. Something was terribly wrong. The Garza family had undoubtedly been up all night, alternating between hope and despair, making phone calls, perhaps driving around town looking for Irene's car, checking with anyone who might have information. By morning, when it was clear that Irene had been missing for more than 12 hours, it was time to involve the authorities. The McAllen Police Department received the missing person report, and what began as a routine procedure quickly escalated into something far more serious. When a 25-year-old woman with no history of running away or erratic behavior fails to come home from church, investigators pay attention. When that woman is a respected schoolteacher, a beauty queen, and a beloved community member, the urgency intensifies even further. The initial investigation focused on retracing Irene's steps and establishing a timeline. Detectives went to Sacred Heart Church and began interviewing anyone who had been there the previous evening. Multiple witnesses confirmed that Irene had arrived at the church around 7 p.m. She'd been seen entering the building and heading toward the confessional area. Several parishioners remembered seeing her, and their descriptions all matched. Irene had appeared completely normal, not distressed or worried. just another member of the congregation coming for confession before Easter. But after entering the confessional area, the trail went cold. No one could definitively say they'd seen her leave the church. This immediately focused attention on what had happened inside Sacred Heart during those confession hours. Father John Feit was questioned as a matter of routine, being one of the priests who had heard confessions that evening and potentially one of the last people to see Irene alive. His account of the evening would become a subject of intense scrutiny in the days, months, and years to come. Feit acknowledged that Irene had come to confession, though he was vague about specifics, perhaps citing the seal of the confessional, which prohibited priests from revealing anything said during the sacrament. He claimed that confession had proceeded normally and that Irene had left the church afterward. But this didn't align with the fact that Irene had never made it home, and it raised immediate questions. If she'd left the church as Feit claimed, where had she gone? Why hadn't she returned home? Had someone intercepted her in the parking lot or on her way home? As Easter Sunday progressed and Irene remained missing, the McAllen Police Department initiated a broader search effort. In a community as tight-knit as McAllen, word of Irene's disappearance spread rapidly. By afternoon, volunteers were organizing search parties. Friends, family members, fellow teachers, students' parents, members of Sacred Heart Parish, and concerned citizens who'd never even met Irene but were moved by her story all came together to help look for her. This was the kind of community response that small towns are known for. When one of their own is in trouble, people show up. Search parties fanned out across McAllen and the surrounding areas, checking parks, vacant lots, drainage ditches, anywhere a person might be if they were lost or injured or worse. The volunteer searchers worked through Easter Sunday and into Monday, their efforts coordinated by local law enforcement but driven by sheer determination and hope. They searched on foot, in cars, calling Irene's name, showing her photograph to anyone they encountered, asking if anyone had seen anything suspicious or unusual on Saturday evening. The mood among the searchers must have been a complex mixture of hope that Irene would be found alive and safe, and growing fear that every hour that passed made that outcome less likely. Statistics about missing persons are grim. The first 24 hours are critical, and once you pass that threshold, the chances of a positive outcome drop dramatically. As Monday turned into Tuesday, the McAllen community was well past that 24-hour mark, and still there was no sign of Irene Garza. Meanwhile, investigators were conducting a more detailed examination of Sacred Heart Church and its surroundings. The church building itself was searched thoroughly, including areas that most parishioners never entered. Evidence technicians processed the confessional booths, looking for any signs of a struggle or anything out of place. The parking lot where Irene would have left her car was examined. Detectives interviewed Father Feit again, this time with more pointed questions. They also spoke with other priests and church staff, trying to piece together everyone's movements during the critical hours of Saturday evening. The church, which had always been seen as a sanctuary, was now being treated as a potential crime scene, and this shift in perception was deeply unsettling for the faithful community. On Tuesday, April 19th, searchers made a significant discovery. Irene's shoes and purse were found in a canal area a few miles from the church. This was both a breakthrough and a devastating development. Finding her belongings confirmed that something bad had indeed happened to Irene. These weren't items she would have voluntarily abandoned. The location where they were found suggested that someone had disposed of them, trying to hide evidence. But the discovery also meant that Irene herself might be nearby, and if her belongings had been thrown into a canal area, the implications for her fate were horrifying. The search efforts now intensified around the canal system that ran through and around McAllen, with particular focus on the area where Irene's possessions had been discovered. For the Garza family, these 2 days of searching must have been an unbearable agony. The hope that Irene might still be alive was warring with the increasingly obvious likelihood that she'd been harmed. Parents, siblings, and extended family members were existing in that horrible limbo where you don't have answers, but you already know, on some deep level, that the news isn't going to be good. The community rallied around the Garzas, offering support, prayers, and practical help, but nothing could truly ease the torment of not knowing what had happened to their beloved Irene. And mixed with the grief and fear was probably a growing anger and confusion. How could this happen? How could a young woman disappear after going to church? What kind of evil could intrude into something as sacred as confession? The McAllen Police Department, meanwhile, was facing intense pressure to solve the case. The media had picked up the story. A beauty queen missing after going to church made for compelling headlines. Reporters from local and regional newspapers were covering the search efforts, interviewing family members, and speculating about what might have happened. The police were working the case hard, but they were also dealing with a situation that had few precedents in their experience. McAllen wasn't accustomed to this level of serious crime. Murders were rare. The disappearance of a prominent young woman under mysterious circumstances was unprecedented. Detectives were following every lead, interviewing every possible witness, but they were also operating in a context where one of the central figures in their investigation was a Catholic priest, and that complicated everything in a town where the church held enormous sway. Thursday, April 21st, 1960 brought the news that everyone had been dreading but expecting. 5 days after Irene Garza had walked into Sacred Heart Church for confession, her body was found. The location was a canal near the town of Mission, just a few miles from McAllen, not far from where her shoes and purse had been discovered 2 days earlier. The body was floating in the water, and when it was recovered, the worst fears of the Garza family and the McAllen community were confirmed. Irene had not run away. She had not gotten lost. She had not had some kind of accident. She had been murdered, and her body had been disposed of in a canal like she was garbage, like her life had meant nothing. The initial examination of Irene's body revealed horrifying details. She had been beaten. There was evidence of sexual assault, though the exact nature and extent would be determined through autopsy. Most significantly, she had been suffocated, a particularly cruel and terrifying way to die, involving several minutes of conscious awareness that you're dying, struggling for air that won't come, experiencing pure terror in your final moments. The medical examiner would later determine that Irene had likely been unconscious or barely conscious for days before she finally died, meaning she'd been kept somewhere, possibly alive, but unable to move or cry out, before being dumped in the canal. This detail would haunt everyone who heard it. The idea that Irene might have been saved if only someone had found her sooner, if only someone had known where to look. The discovery of Irene's body transformed the case from a missing person investigation into a homicide investigation, and the stakes changed dramatically. The McAllen Police Department now had the full resources of a murder investigation at their disposal, including assistance from state law enforcement agencies. But they also had a victim whose last known location was a church confessional, and the implications of that were almost too disturbing to process. The investigation immediately intensified its focus on Father John Feit, because the timeline and circumstances made him not just a witness, but the primary suspect. If Irene had gone into the confessional booth with Feit and never come out alive, then either Feit had killed her, or he knew something about what had happened to her. As news of Irene's death spread through McAllen, the community's grief was mixed with shock, anger, and a profound sense of betrayal. The safe haven of Sacred Heart Church had been violated. The trust that parishioners placed in their priests was shattered. Parents who had sent their children to religious education classes, who had confessed their own sins to Father Feit, who had taken communion from his hands, now wondered what kind of monster might have been hiding behind that Roman collar. The cognitive dissonance was immense. How do you reconcile the image of a priest, a man who has taken vows of celibacy and service to God, with the image of a brutal murderer? For many in the community, it was simply too much to accept. There had to be another explanation. Maybe someone else had attacked Irene after she left the church. Maybe Father Feit had seen something, but was too frightened to say. Maybe this was all a terrible misunderstanding. But investigators weren't dealing in maybes and misunderstandings. They were dealing in evidence and timelines and witness statements. And everything they were finding pointed in one direction. The problem was proving it. The problem was building a case strong enough to overcome the institutional power of the Catholic Church, which was already beginning to circle the wagons around one of its own. The problem was convincing a jury in a deeply Catholic community that a priest could commit such a heinous crime. The problem was that physical evidence, in 1960, was much harder to collect and analyze than it would be in later decades. There was no DNA testing, no sophisticated forensics, just witness testimony, circumstantial evidence, and the grueling work of building a case piece by piece. The Garza family buried their daughter, their sister, their beloved Irene, in a funeral that the entire community attended. The grief was palpable, the sense of injustice overwhelming. A young woman whose entire life had been ahead of her had been brutally murdered, and everyone knew, or at least strongly suspected, who was responsible. But suspicion isn't the same as proof, and in the American justice system, even the strongest suspicion requires evidence to result in a conviction. As the mourners left the cemetery and tried to return to some semblance of normal life, the question hanging over McAllen was whether justice would ever be served for Irene Garza, or whether her killer would escape punishment behind the protective shield of the priesthood. Father John Feit was not a native of McAllen, Texas. He had come to Sacred Heart Church as part of his assignment within the Oblates of Mary Immaculate, a Catholic missionary religious order that operated extensively throughout Texas and the southwestern United States. Born in 1931, Feit had grown up in the San Antonio area in a German-American Catholic family, the kind of household where faith wasn't just practiced, but was the cornerstone of identity and daily life. By all accounts, his path to the priesthood had seemed natural, even inevitable. He'd attended Catholic schools, served as an altar boy, and demonstrated the kind of piety and commitment that made church leaders take notice. He entered the seminary as a young man, undertook the years of study and spiritual formation required for ordination, and was finally ordained as a priest in 1958, just 2 years before Irene Garza's murder. At 28 years old in 1960, Feit was still relatively new to priestly ministry. He was young, perhaps still finding his footing in the role, learning how to navigate the various demands that came with being a priest in a busy parish. Those who interacted with him casually might have found him unremarkable, quiet, somewhat awkward socially, not the kind of charismatic figure who commanded a room. He was of average height and build, with dark hair and features that suggested his German heritage. In photographs from that era, he looks like exactly what he was supposed to be, a serious young priest, devoted to his calling, serving his community. Nothing about his appearance suggested violence or danger. But then again, predators rarely advertise themselves, especially those skilled enough to hide within institutions that demand trust and provide cover. Within days of Irene Garza's body being discovered, investigators had zeroed in on Father Feit as their primary suspect. The timeline alone made him a person of critical interest. Irene had entered the confessional booth where Feit was hearing confessions, and there was no reliable evidence that she'd ever left the church alive. Witnesses had seen her arrive, seen her go toward the confessional area, but no one could definitively say they'd seen her depart. When investigators pressed Feit for details about his interaction with Irene, his answers were vague and sometimes contradictory. He acknowledged hearing her confession but claimed she'd left afterward, though he couldn't provide specifics about when or how. He seemed nervous during questioning, which could be attributed to the stress of being questioned about a murder, but experienced detectives know the difference between innocent nervousness and the anxiety of someone hiding something terrible. The physical evidence, such as it was in 1960, also pointed toward Feit. When investigators examined the church more thoroughly, they discovered traces of blood in areas where there shouldn't have been blood, not in the main sanctuary where minor accidents might occasionally occur, but in more secluded areas of the building. There were signs that something heavy had been dragged or carried through certain corridors, though the evidence was circumstantial and could potentially be explained away. Most damning, however, was the discovery of what appeared to be blood on a portable viewing screen that had been moved from its usual location. This screen, used for religious education presentations, seemed to have been employed for a far more sinister purpose, possibly to transport or conceal Irene's body within the church before moving it elsewhere. Investigators also learned something that sent chills through the community and strengthened their suspicions about Feit. Just 3 months earlier, in January 1960, there had been another incident involving Father Feit and a young woman. A 20-year-old parishioner named Maria America Guerra had been attacked in the rectory of a different church where Feit had been assigned. Guerra reported that Feit had attempted to sexually assault her, and during the attack, he had tried to suffocate her by pressing down on her throat. She had managed to fight him off and escape, and she had reported the incident to church authorities. But here's where the institutional protection became clear. Feit had been quietly reassigned to Sacred Heart Church in McAllen, and the incident was essentially swept under the rug. No criminal charges were filed. Guerra's accusation was handled internally by the church, and Feit was simply moved to a new location where parishioners had no idea about his history. This pattern of moving problematic priests rather than removing them from ministry would later become infamous as the Catholic Church's sexual abuse scandals came to light decades later, but in 1960, it was simply standard operating procedure. The similarities between the Guerra attack and what had happened to Irene Garza were impossible to ignore. Both involved young women. Both involved suffocation or attempted suffocation. Both occurred in church settings with Feit as the perpetrator or suspect. The modus operandi was consistent enough that investigators were confident they were dealing with the same offender. Guerra's willingness to come forward and testify about what Feit had done to her provided crucial context for understanding what might have happened to Irene. It established a pattern of behavior, demonstrated that Feit was capable of violence against women, and showed that he'd already used suffocation as a method of attack. In many cases, this kind of prior bad act evidence would be enough to build a prosecution, especially when combined with the circumstantial evidence from Irene's murder. But building a case against a Catholic priest in 1960s South Texas was monumentally difficult for reasons that extended far beyond the evidence itself. The Catholic Church wielded enormous power in the community, and the idea of a priest committing murder was so antithetical to everything the church represented that many people simply refused to believe it was possible. Church leadership, both locally and at higher levels, closed ranks around Feit. While they didn't explicitly obstruct the investigation, that would have been too obvious. They certainly didn't facilitate it either. Requests for information were met with bureaucratic delays. Feit's superiors provided character references attesting to his piety and dedication. The institutional machinery of the church moved to protect one of its own, not out of any belief that Feit was innocent necessarily, but out of a desire to protect the church's reputation and authority. The district attorney's office faced an impossible calculus. They had a suspect they believed was guilty. They had circumstantial evidence pointing to that suspect. They had a prior incident establishing a pattern, but they also had to consider whether they could actually win a conviction in court. The jury pool would be drawn from Hidalgo County, where the majority of residents were Catholic and where challenging a priest's integrity was tantamount to challenging God himself. Defense attorneys for Feit would undoubtedly play on this dynamic, portraying any prosecution as an attack on the church and on faith itself. They would emphasize the lack of direct physical evidence. No witnesses to the actual murder, no confession, no definitive forensic proof. They would attack the character of witnesses and suggest alternative theories for what had happened to Irene. In short, they would create enough reasonable doubt that a jury of faithful Catholics might not be willing to convict, regardless of how suspicious the circumstances appeared. Father Feit was eventually charged, but not with murder. In a decision that would haunt the Garza family for decades, prosecutors chose to charge him only with the attack on Maria America Guerra. Perhaps they calculated that this was a case they could actually win. There was a living victim who could testify. The attack was more recent, so evidence was fresher, and the charge was less severe, so a jury might be more willing to convict. Or perhaps they were testing the waters, seeing if they could get any kind of conviction against Feit that would then open the door to pursuing murder charges. Whatever the reasoning, Feit went to trial in 1961 for the attempted sexual assault of Guerra, and the McAllen community watched closely to see if justice would be served. The trial revealed the difficulties of prosecuting clergy in that era. Guerra testified about what Feit had done to her, describing the attack in detail, explaining how she'd fought him off and reported the incident. But Feit's defense team portrayed Guerra as mentally unstable, suggested she'd misunderstood an innocent interaction, and emphasized that Feit was a man of God who would never engage in such behavior. Character witnesses testified to Feit's reputation for piety and service. The defense created a narrative where a confused young woman had misinterpreted priestly concern for something sinister, where her accusations were the product of imagination or even malice rather than reality. And incredibly, devastatingly, it worked. The jury deliberated and returned a verdict that shocked many observers. They couldn't reach a unanimous decision, resulting in a hung jury. The judge declared a mistrial, and when prosecutors considered whether to retry the case, they made the fateful decision not to pursue it further. With the Guerra case ending in a mistrial and no retrial forthcoming, the prospects for charging Feit with Irene Garza's murder effectively evaporated. If prosecutors couldn't even get a conviction for an attack where the victim was alive to testify, How could they possibly hope to convict for murder based on circumstantial evidence? The institutional and cultural barriers were simply too formidable. The McAllen Police Department maintained their investigation files, keeping Feit as their primary suspect. But without new evidence or a significant change in circumstances, there was no path forward to prosecution. Father John Feit remained free, and more shockingly, he remained in priestly ministry. The church's response to the situation was to do what it had done after the Guerra incident: reassign Feit far away from the scene of his alleged crimes. He was sent to a monastery in Missouri, where he could be supervised and where his contact with parishioners, particularly female parishioners, could be limited. This wasn't punishment in any meaningful sense, it was damage control. Feit eventually left the active priesthood, though whether this was his choice or pressure from superiors is unclear. He married, had children, and settled into what appeared from the outside to be a normal middle-class American life. He worked various jobs, remained active in his community, and to his neighbors and acquaintances, he was just another guy. A former priest who'd left ministry to marry. Nothing particularly remarkable or concerning about him. But back in McAllen, Texas, the name John Feit was synonymous with injustice. The Garza family knew who had killed their daughter, sister, beloved Irene. The investigators who'd worked the case knew who had done it. Many in the community suspected or believed Feit was guilty. But suspicion and belief don't equal justice, and Feit living his life freely while Irene lay in her grave was a wound that never healed. The case remained officially open but practically dormant. Detectives who'd worked it originally retired or moved on, though many kept the file close, hoping that someday new evidence would emerge or circumstances would change enough to allow prosecution. The man in the collar had seemingly gotten away with murder, protected by an institution that valued its reputation more than accountability, enabled by a justice system that couldn't overcome the cultural and evidentiary barriers of prosecuting clergy, and sheltered by a society that preferred to believe priests were incapable of such evil rather than confronting the uncomfortable reality that predators can hide anywhere, even behind symbols of ultimate trust and sanctity. John Feit had gone from being Father Feit, spiritual shepherd, to being the monster who'd stolen Irene Garza's life and then escaped justice. The Roman collar that should have represented a higher calling and moral authority had instead become a shield for evil, and for decades it seemed that shield was impenetrable. The 1960s moved forward, and the world changed in profound ways. The civil rights movement transformed American society. The Vietnam War divided the nation. The sexual revolution challenged traditional values. The women's liberation movement demanded equality. Assassinations of political leaders shocked the country. Humans walked on the moon. But in McAllen, Texas, for the Garza family, time stood still in one crucial way. Irene's murder remained unsolved, and her killer remained free. The decade that had begun with such promise for Irene, with her teaching career flourishing and her whole life ahead of her, instead became defined by absence and injustice. For Irene's parents, the loss of a child is a grief that never fully heals, but losing a child to murder and then watching the suspected killer escape justice adds layers of trauma that are almost unbearable. They had raised Irene with love and care, instilled values of faith and service, watched her grow into a remarkable young woman, and then had her stolen from them in the most violent, cruel way imaginable. And then, as if that wasn't enough suffering, they had to watch as the justice system failed to hold anyone accountable. They had to see Father John Feit walk free, had to know he was out there somewhere living his life, while Irene's life had been cut short at 25. The unfairness of it must have eaten at them constantly, a bitter poison that no amount of faith or prayer could fully neutralize. The McAllen community tried to move forward, but Irene's case cast a long shadow. Sacred Heart Church continued to serve its parishioners, but for many, the building would forever be associated with what had happened there. Some families left the parish, unable to worship in a place where such evil had occurred. Others stayed but carried with them a wariness, a loss of innocence about the safety and sanctity of church spaces. The case became part of local lore, the kind of story that gets told and retold, that new residents hear about when they move to town, that serves as a cautionary tale about trust and vulnerability. Father John Feit, meanwhile, was living in Missouri, far removed from the scene of his alleged crime. He had been laicized, officially released from his priestly vows and returned to lay status, though the exact circumstances and timing of this process are somewhat murky. He married a woman named John Feit, and together they built a life that appeared conventionally respectable. He worked various jobs over the years, reportedly in education and counseling at times, which is deeply disturbing given what he was suspected of having done. The idea that Feit might have had access to vulnerable people in professional capacities, that he might have been counseling troubled individuals or working with students, is chilling when considered against the backdrop of Irene's murder and the attack on Maria America Guerra. Feit's ability to maintain a seemingly normal life speaks to several troubling realities. First, the geographical distance between Missouri and Texas meant that most people in his new community had no idea about his past. This was decades before the internet made information easily accessible across distances, before background checks were routine for most jobs, before sex offender registries and public databases made it harder for people with violent histories to simply relocate and start fresh. Feit could present himself as a former priest who'd chosen married life, and without any convictions on his record, there was nothing to officially flag him as dangerous. Second, his ability to move on with his life while under suspicion for murder reveals the privilege afforded to those who've never been formally convicted. In the eyes of the law and in the practical realities of daily life, he was innocent until proven guilty, and since he'd never been proven guilty, he was treated as innocent. Back in the Rio Grande Valley, investigators who'd worked Irene's case carried the weight of the unsolved murder throughout their careers. Cold cases have a particular pain for law enforcement officers who've invested time, energy, and emotional commitment into seeking justice for victims. They know who did it, they believe they know how it happened, but they can't prove it to the legal standard required for conviction. Files sit in storage, evidence boxes gather dust, and the victim's face in crime scene photos haunts those who couldn't close the case. Some of the original investigators retired while still hoping for a breakthrough. Others passed away, taking with them first-hand knowledge of the investigation and details that might have been crucial if the case ever went to trial. The Catholic Church's broader reckoning with sexual abuse and misconduct was still decades away. The pattern of behavior that had protected Feit, the quiet reassignments, the institutional cover-ups, the prioritization of the Church's reputation over victims' safety, was happening in parishes and dioceses across the world, but it remained largely hidden from public view. Victims who came forward were silenced, threatened, or dismissed. Abusive clergy were moved from place to place, given fresh opportunities to harm new victims who had no warning about who they were dealing with. The system that protected Feit after the Guerra attack was the same system that was protecting countless other predatory priests, and it would take investigative journalism and victim advocacy movements to finally force the Church to confront these patterns in the late 1990s and early 2000s. For the Garza family, the 1970s, 1980s, and 1990s brought the normal milestones of life: marriages, births, deaths, career changes, all the markers of time passing, but always with the shadow of Irene's unsolved murder. Family gatherings probably involved someone mentioning Irene, remembering something about her, wondering aloud whether justice would ever come. Her siblings grew older, had children of their own who never got to meet their Aunt Irene except through stories and photographs. Those nieces and nephews grew up knowing about the tragedy that had shaped their family, about the beautiful young woman whose life had been stolen and whose case remained open but apparently unsolvable. As forensic science advanced dramatically during these decades, with DNA analysis becoming available in the 1980s and increasingly sophisticated in the 1990s, there was perhaps some hope that new technology might crack old cases. Cold case units were being established in police departments across the country, specifically to re-examine unsolved crimes with fresh eyes and new tools. Some cases from the 1960s were indeed being solved decades later because DNA evidence from crime scenes could finally be analyzed and matched to suspects. But for the Garza case, the passage of time and the conditions under which Irene's body had been found meant that DNA evidence was likely degraded or unusable. The case would need to be solved through other means if it was ever going to be solved at all. The year 2002 marked a turning point, though it would take time for the significance to become fully apparent. Two former priests, men who had known John Feit during his time in active ministry, came forward with stunning revelations. Dale Tacheny and Joseph O'Brien, Both men who had themselves left the priesthood years earlier approached authorities with information they said they'd been carrying for decades. According to their accounts, Feit had confessed to them, not in the formal sacramental sense, but in personal conversations, that he had killed a young woman in Texas back in the 1960s. The details Feit allegedly shared matched what had happened to Irene Garza. Tachini's account was particularly detailed and disturbing. He said that Feit had told him about attacking a woman who had come to confession, about how he'd assaulted her and then, in a panic about being discovered, had killed her to silence her. Feit had allegedly described his actions with a mixture of guilt and rationalization, the way perpetrators often do when confessing to peers rather than to authorities, acknowledging what he'd done while also framing it in ways that minimized his culpability or made it seem like circumstances had forced his hand. O'Brien corroborated aspects of Tachini's account, saying that Feit had made admissions to him as well, though perhaps less detailed. The question that immediately arose was, why had these men waited over 40 years to come forward? Why had they kept silent while Feit remained free, while the Garza family suffered without justice, while the case sat unsolved? Both Tachini and O'Brien explained their silence in terms of the culture of the priesthood. There was an expectation, a code almost, that what was shared between priests remained confidential even if it wasn't technically protected by the seal of confession. They described feeling conflicted about what they knew, wrestling with whether they had an obligation to report it, and ultimately being influenced by the church's tendency to handle problems internally rather than involving civil authorities. By 2002, however, with the Catholic Church's sexual abuse scandal exploding into public consciousness, and with both men no longer active in ministry, they apparently felt released from whatever obligation to silence they'd felt before. The new information from Tachini and O'Brien should have been the breakthrough the case needed. Here were witnesses who could testify that Feit had admitted to killing Irene Garza. Their testimony would be hearsay. They couldn't testify to what Feit did, only to what he'd told them. But in many jurisdictions, admissions of a defendant can be introduced through witness testimony. The problem was that this information came to light more than 4 decades after the crime, and the passage of time had created numerous obstacles to prosecution. Evidence had degraded or been lost. Witnesses had died or their memories had faded. John Feit was now in his 70s, and any defense attorney would argue that his advanced age and the passage of time made it impossible for him to receive a fair trial. Despite these challenges, the revelations from Tachini and O'Brien did prompt renewed interest in the case. Local news media picked up the story, and for a time, Irene Garza's murder was back in the public consciousness. Some articles were written, some TV segments aired, and pressure began building on authorities to take another look at the case. But pressure and action are two different things, and what happened next, or more accurately, what didn't happen next, would prove frustratingly familiar to those who had watched Feit escape justice decades earlier. Incredibly, astoundingly, it would take another 15 years before any meaningful action occurred. From 2002, when Tachini and O'Brien came forward, to 2015, the case remained in limbo. The wheels of justice, which had ground to a halt in the 1960s, remained stubbornly still. The reasons for this delay are complex and involve changes in local prosecutors, questions about the strength of the evidence, concerns about the cost and difficulty of prosecuting a decades-old case, and probably some degree of institutional reluctance to reopen wounds that had scarred the community for so long. But for the Garza family, every year that passed without action was another year of injustice, another year of watching their loved one's killer live freely while Irene remained in her grave. The decades of silence weren't just about a case gathering dust in storage. They were about a fundamental failure of institutions to prioritize truth and justice over comfort and convenience. The Catholic Church had failed by protecting Feit instead of turning him over to authorities. The justice system had failed by not pursuing prosecution vigorously enough in the 1960s when evidence was fresh. And in some sense, society had failed by being more willing to believe in the inherent goodness of priests than to confront the reality that evil can hide behind any facade, including religious authority. The silence protected Feit but tormented everyone who'd loved Irene Garza, and it would take extraordinary persistence and advocacy to finally break through that silence and move toward the justice that had been denied for more than half a century. The year 2015 brought renewed hope to a case that had seemed frozen in time. 55 years after Irene Garza's murder, the Hidalgo County District Attorney's Office, under the leadership of DA Ricardo Rodriguez, announced that they were reopening the investigation and seriously considering bringing charges against John Feit. What had changed? Several factors converged to make prosecution possible where it hadn't been before. First, there was a new generation of prosecutors who hadn't lived through the original case and could approach it with fresh eyes, unburdened by the political and social pressures that had hamstrung earlier efforts. Second, the Catholic Church's authority had been significantly diminished by the sexual abuse scandals that had rocked the institution throughout the early 2000s, making juries potentially more willing to believe that a priest could commit such a crime. Third, and perhaps most importantly, there was a renewed sense that justice delayed shouldn't mean justice forever denied, that even decades-old cases deserved resolution if the evidence supported prosecution. The decision to pursue the case wasn't made lightly. Prosecutors had to grapple with very real challenges that come with trying a case more than 5 decades after the crime. Physical evidence from 1960 had either been lost, degraded beyond usefulness, or was subject to serious chain-of-custody questions that defense attorneys would certainly attack. Many witnesses from the original investigation had died, taking their first-hand knowledge to their graves. The crime scene itself, Sacred Heart Church, had been renovated multiple times over the decades, making it impossible to reconstruct exact conditions from that April evening in 1960. And the defendant, John Feit, was now 85 years old, which meant defense attorneys would argue that his advanced age and any health issues constituted both a humanitarian reason not to prosecute and a practical impediment to his ability to assist in his own defense. But prosecutors also had several factors working in their favor. The timeline and circumstantial evidence pointing to Feit remained as damning as ever. Irene had entered the church where Feit was hearing confessions and never left alive, and Feit had been the last known person to see her. The prior attack on Maria America Guerra established a pattern of behavior and showed that Feit had previously used suffocation in an assault on a young woman in a church setting. Most significantly, prosecutors had the testimony of Dale Tacheny and Joseph O'Brien, the former priests who could testify about Feit's admissions regarding killing a woman in Texas. While hearsay rules generally prohibit witnesses from testifying about what someone else said, there are exceptions, and admissions by a party opponent, statements made by the defendant about the crime, typically can be introduced through witness testimony. The investigation that began in 2015 involved re-interviewing anyone still alive who had been connected to the original case, reviewing decades-old evidence and reports, consulting with forensic experts about what could and couldn't be proven with the evidence that remained, and building a legal strategy that could overcome the defense's inevitable arguments about the passage of time. Investigators also needed to locate and prepare Dale Tacheny, who had since moved and whose testimony would be absolutely critical to the prosecution's case. They needed to be ready for an aggressive defense that would attack every aspect of the case, from the reliability of decades-old memories to the motives of witnesses coming forward after so long. In February 2016, after months of preparation, authorities made the decision to move forward. An arrest warrant was issued for John Bernard Feit on a charge of murder in the death of Irene Garza. The moment that warrant was signed represented a victory for persistence, for the Garza family who had never stopped seeking justice, and for investigators who had believed for 56 years that they knew who had killed Irene but hadn't been able to prove it in court. Law enforcement officers traveled to Arizona, where Feit was now living in retirement, to take him into custody. The arrest of an 85-year-old man on charges stemming from a crime committed when he was 28 made national news. Media outlets covered the story as an example of cold cases being solved decades later, of justice systems finally catching up with criminals who'd evaded accountability for most of their lives. Feit was extradited back to Texas to face charges. The booking photo from his arrest shows an elderly man, stooped and gray-haired, looking every bit his 85 years. It's jarring to see that photo next to photographs of Father Feit from 1960, the young priest with dark hair and an unlined face, wearing his Roman collar, looking like any other clergyman of that era. The physical transformation that happens over 56 years is dramatic, but it raises uncomfortable questions about the nature of justice. Is it meaningful to prosecute someone when they're so old and removed from who they were when they committed the crime? Prosecutors and victims advocates would argue absolutely yes. Justice doesn't have an expiration date, and victims deserve accountability regardless of how much time has passed. Defense attorneys and some civil libertarians might argue that prosecuting elderly defendants for ancient crimes raises concerns about fairness, about whether someone can effectively defend themselves against accusations from the distant past, about whether punishment serves any purpose when the person is near the end of their life anyway. The period between Feit's arrest in 2016 and his trial in 2017 involved extensive pretrial maneuvering. Defense attorneys filed numerous motions challenging the prosecution's ability to proceed. They argued that the passage of time had prejudiced Feit's ability to mount an effective defense. How could he possibly locate witnesses or remember details from 56 years ago? They argued that much of the evidence was inadmissible hearsay. They questioned whether Feit was mentally and physically capable of enduring a trial, given his age and health status. They made every argument they could to get the charges dismissed or to limit what evidence could be presented at trial. The prosecution had to respond to each motion, defending their right to pursue the case and arguing for the admissibility of crucial evidence, particularly the testimony about Feit's alleged admissions. One of the most contentious pretrial issues involved Dale Tacheni's testimony. The defense wanted to exclude it entirely, arguing it was unreliable hearsay from conversations that had allegedly occurred decades earlier with no corroboration. They attacked Tacheni's credibility, suggesting he might have fabricated or embellished the admissions for attention or out of some personal grudge against Feit. They pointed out that Tacheni had waited over 40 years to come forward, which they argued cast doubt on his honesty and reliability. The prosecution countered that Tacheni's testimony fell under established exceptions to hearsay rules and that his testimony was corroborated by Joseph O'Brien's similar account. The judge ultimately ruled that Tacheni could testify, a crucial victory for the prosecution that kept their case viable. As the trial date approached, both sides prepared their strategies. The prosecution's theory would be straightforward. Irene Garza came to Sacred Heart Church for confession. Father John Feit attacked her in or near the confessional booth, sexually assaulted her, and then killed her to prevent her from reporting what he'd done. He had then hidden her body somewhere in the church or its surroundings before eventually disposing of it in the canal where it was found days later. The attack on Maria America Guerra 3 months earlier established that Feit had a pattern of assaulting young women in church settings and using suffocation as his method. His admissions to fellow priests confirmed his guilt. The timeline and circumstantial evidence all pointed to him as the only realistic suspect. The defense's strategy would focus on creating reasonable doubt. They would emphasize the lack of direct physical evidence tying Feit to the murder. They would attack the reliability of witnesses testifying about events from 56 years earlier. They would question why it had taken so long to bring charges if the evidence was so compelling. They would humanize Feit as an elderly man who had lived a law-abiding life for decades, who had a family, who had never been convicted of any crime despite being under suspicion for over half a century. They would suggest that the prosecution was engaging in a witch hunt, that Feit was being scapegoated for a crime that remained unsolved because authorities needed to blame someone. They would argue that without physical evidence, without eyewitnesses to the actual murder, without a confession to police, there simply wasn't proof beyond a reasonable doubt that Feit had killed Irene Garza. The Garza family, meanwhile, was preparing emotionally for a trial that would force them to relive the worst experience of their lives. Family members who had been young adults, or even children in 1960 were now elderly themselves. Irene's parents had both passed away without seeing justice for their daughter, a source of profound sadness for surviving family members who knew how much her parents had wanted to see Feit held accountable. Nieces and nephews who had never known Irene except through family stories were preparing to attend the trial, to finally see some acknowledgement of what had been taken from their family. The trial would be emotionally devastating regardless of the outcome, but at least it represented something: recognition, official acknowledgement, a chance at justice, even if that chance came more than 5 decades too late. Public interest in the trial was substantial, both locally and nationally. True crime enthusiasts followed developments closely, drawn by the extraordinary length of time between crime and prosecution, by the involvement of a Catholic priest, and by the dramatic arc of a case that had seemed permanently cold suddenly roaring back to life. Local media in the Rio Grande Valley covered every development, recognizing that this trial was about more than one murder. It was about the community's history, about wounds that had never fully healed, about questions of institutional accountability and justice delayed. National media outlets sent reporters to cover a trial that raised fascinating legal questions about the limits of how far back the justice system can reach and whether ancient crimes can be fairly adjudicated. As the trial date finally arrived in 2017, everyone involved knew they were participating in something historic. This wasn't just another murder trial. It was the resolution, one way or another, of the oldest cold case that had ever been brought to trial in American history. For Feit, it was finally facing accountability he'd evaded for 57 years, or alternatively, defending himself against accusations that he'd be able to argue were impossible to fairly contest after so much time. For the Garza family, it was the justice they'd sought for over half a century, or the final devastating blow of watching Feit be acquitted and validated in his denials. For the legal system, it was a test of whether justice truly has no expiration date, or whether some cases are simply too old to prosecute fairly. And for Irene Garza, who had been 25 years old when her life was stolen, who had never had the chance to marry, have children, grow old, or live any of the dreams she'd held, the trial represented something she couldn't experience herself. The world finally, officially, acknowledging what had been done to her and attempting, however imperfectly, to set the scales of justice right. The trial of John Bernard Feit began in December 2017 in Hidalgo County, Texas, more than 57 years after Irene Garza's murder. The courtroom was packed with media, members of the Garza family, curious members of the public, and those who'd followed the case for decades and wanted to witness this historic moment. At the defense table sat Feit, now 85 years old, looking frail and elderly, a stark contrast to the young priest who had heard confessions at Sacred Heart Church on that April evening in 1960. His defense team surrounded him, prepared to mount an aggressive defense against charges they argued should never have been brought. At the prosecution table, the legal team that had spent years preparing for this moment reviewed their notes and evidence, knowing that the weight of decades of injustice rested on their ability to finally secure a conviction. The jury selection process was critical. Prosecutors needed to find jurors who could set aside any lingering reverence for clergy and objectively evaluate evidence against a former priest. They needed people who understood that the passage of time doesn't erase culpability, that justice delayed is still justice worth pursuing. Defense attorneys, conversely, needed jurors who would be skeptical of a prosecution based largely on events from over half a century ago, who would demand rock-solid proof before convicting an elderly man of ancient crimes, who might have sympathy for someone they saw as being persecuted in old age. The jury that was eventually seated would hold Irene Garza's fate in their hands, tasked with determining whether the evidence presented proved beyond reasonable doubt that John Feit had murdered her on April 16, 1960. The prosecution's opening statement painted a clear picture of what they believed had happened. Irene Garza, a beloved teacher and beauty queen, had gone to Sacred Heart Church for confession on Holy Saturday. She entered the confessional booth where Father Feit was hearing confessions. Feit attacked her, likely attempting sexual assault. When Irene fought back or threatened to report him, Feit panicked and killed her, using suffocation, the same method he'd used just 3 months earlier in his attack on Maria America Guerra. He hid her body in the church, keeping her there while searches were conducted, and then disposed of her body in a canal when he could do so without being observed. The prosecution emphasized that Feit was the last person to see Irene alive, that his pattern of behavior matched the crime, and most damningly, that he had confessed to fellow priests years later, admissions that would be detailed through witness testimony. The defense's opening statement took a different approach entirely. They portrayed John Feit as a victim of a rush to judgment, a man who had been suspected simply because he was the last known person to interact with Irene Garza, but against whom there was no actual proof of guilt. They emphasized the lack of physical evidence. No DNA, no fingerprints definitively tying Feit to the murder, no weapon, no crime scene that could be forensically linked to him. They attacked the credibility of witnesses testifying about events from 57 years ago, suggesting that memories fade, that details become confused, that what people think they remember from decades ago may not be reliable. They portrayed the alleged confessions to other priests as hearsay at best, fabrications at worst, suggesting that Dale Tacheny and others might have motivations for claiming Feit had confessed when he actually hadn't. The defense's strategy was clear: create enough doubt that the jury couldn't be certain beyond a reasonable doubt that Feit was guilty. As the trial progressed, the prosecution called witnesses who could establish the timeline and circumstances of Irene's disappearance. Former parishioners, now elderly themselves, testified about seeing Irene at Sacred Heart Church that evening, about the confession schedule, about the layout of the church, and where things were located. Some of these witnesses had been young adults in 1960 and were now in their 70s or 80s, their testimony spanning nearly 6 decades. The passage of time was evident in their sometimes uncertain recollections, but the core facts remained consistent. Irene had been there, she'd gone to confession, and she'd never been seen leaving alive. The testimony about the attack on Maria America Guerra was particularly powerful. Guerra herself, now decades older but still bearing the trauma of what Feit had done to her, testified about the assault in the church rectory, about Feit's attempt to suffocate her, about how she'd fought him off and immediately reported it to church authorities. Her testimony established the pattern that prosecutors argued was crucial to understanding Irene's murder. Feit had attacked young women in church settings before, he had used suffocation before, and when faced with the possibility of being reported and exposed, he was capable of violence. The defense objected strenuously to this testimony, arguing that accusations about a separate incident shouldn't be used to prove guilt in this case, but the judge allowed it as evidence of pattern and modus operandi. Then came the moment the trial had been building toward. Dale Tacheny took the stand. Now in his 70s, Tacheny had been a priest alongside Feit decades earlier, and according to his testimony, Feit had confessed to him about killing Irene Garza. Tacheny described conversations with Feit where the younger priest had been wrestling with guilt over what he'd done. According to Tacheny, Feit had described attacking Irene during confession, sexually assaulting her, and then realizing he couldn't let her report what he'd done because it would destroy his priesthood and his life. So he'd killed her, hidden her body in the church for several days while searchers looked for her elsewhere, and then disposed of her body in the canal where it was eventually found. The details Feit allegedly provided matched the known facts of the case in ways that seemed too specific to be coincidental or fabricated. The defense's cross-examination of Tacheny was aggressive and thorough. They attacked his memory. How could he remember specific conversations from over 40 years ago? They questioned his motives. Did he have some grudge against Feit? Some reason to want to see him convicted? They emphasized that he'd waited decades to come forward. If he'd really known about a murder, why hadn't he reported it immediately? Tacheny's answers were consistent but emotional. He explained that the culture of the priesthood, the expectation of confidentiality even outside of formal confession, and his own uncertainty about whether he had an obligation to report what Feit had told him had kept him silent for years. But as the Catholic Church's sexual abuse scandals came to light, and as he'd gotten older and grappled with his own conscience, he'd realized he couldn't take this knowledge to his grave without attempting to provide justice for Irene Garza and her family. The prosecution also presented testimony from Joseph O'Brien, another former priest who corroborated aspects of Tacheny's account. While O'Brien's recollections were perhaps less detailed than Tacheny's, his testimony supported the claim that Feit had made admissions about killing a woman in Texas. Having two independent witnesses testifying to similar admissions strengthened the prosecution's case significantly, making it harder for the defense to argue that Tacheny had simply fabricated the entire story. Expert witnesses were called to discuss the forensic evidence that remained from 1960, limited though it was. Medical examiners testified about Irene's autopsy results, the evidence of sexual assault, the suffocation that had killed her, the timeline suggesting she'd been unconscious or barely conscious for days before death. Investigators who'd worked the original case or had reviewed it more recently testified about the physical evidence found at Sacred Heart Church, about Irene's belongings discovered in the canal area, about the circumstantial web of evidence that all pointed toward Feit. While none of this evidence was the smoking gun that modern juries often expect from watching crime shows on television, It all contributed to a picture of what had happened and who was responsible. The defense called their own witnesses, primarily character witnesses who testified about Feit's life after leaving the priesthood, his marriage, his work, his reputation as a good neighbor and community member. They were attempting to portray Feit as someone who had lived a blameless life for over 50 years, someone who didn't fit the profile of a murderer. They suggested that if Feit had really killed Irene Garza, wouldn't he have committed other crimes? Wouldn't there be other victims? The fact that he'd lived quietly for decades, they argued, suggested he wasn't capable of the violence alleged in this case. Of course, the prosecution's rebuttal to this argument was simple. The reason Feit hadn't committed other murders was because he'd learned from his first one, because after the close call with the Garrow attack and the investigation into Irene's death, he'd understood that continuing such behavior would inevitably lead to his exposure and conviction. Feit himself faced a crucial decision, whether to testify in his own defense. This is always a risky choice for defendants. Testifying allows them to tell their side of the story directly to the jury, to look jurors in the eyes and proclaim innocence. But it also opens them up to cross-examination, where prosecutors can ask difficult questions, probe inconsistencies, and potentially trap them in lies or contradictions. After consultation with his attorneys, Feit made the decision not to testify. This is his constitutional right. Defendants cannot be compelled to testify against themselves, and juries are instructed not to draw negative inferences from a defendant's choice not to take the stand. But in practical terms, jurors often do wonder what a defendant might have said if they'd chosen to testify, and the absence of the defendant's own voice telling their story can leave a gap in the defense's case. The closing arguments brought everything together. The prosecution's closing was a powerful summation of all the evidence. The timeline showing Feit was the last person to see Irene alive, the pattern of behavior established by the Garrow attack, the admissions Feit made to fellow priests, the web of circumstantial evidence that all pointed to his guilt. They asked the jury to consider the totality of the evidence and to recognize that while no single piece might be conclusive on its own, together they told a clear story of what had happened on that holy Saturday in 1960. They reminded jurors of Irene Garza herself, the 25-year-old teacher whose life had been stolen, who deserved justice even though that justice had been delayed for nearly 6 decades. They emphasized that justice doesn't have an expiration date, that the passage of time doesn't erase culpability, and that the jury had an opportunity to finally give Irene Garza and her family the justice they'd been denied for 57 years. The defense's closing argument emphasized reasonable doubt. They reminded the jury that the prosecution bore the burden of proving guilt beyond a reasonable doubt, and they argued that the evidence presented fell short of that standard. They pointed to the lack of physical evidence, the reliance on decades-old memories, the questionable credibility of witnesses who'd waited so long to come forward. They portrayed the prosecution's case as built on speculation and conjecture rather than solid proof. They asked the jury to consider whether they could really be certain, beyond all reasonable doubt, about events that had occurred 57 years ago based on the evidence that had been presented. They reminded jurors that a verdict of not guilty doesn't necessarily mean they believe Feit is innocent. It simply means the prosecution hasn't met its burden of proof. The jury deliberated for several hours over multiple days. The tension in the courthouse was palpable as everyone waited for a verdict. For the Garza family, these hours must have been excruciating. After 57 years of waiting, the final answer was now in the hands of 12 strangers who would determine whether John Feit would finally be held accountable or would be acquitted and able to live out his remaining years as a free man. When word came that the jury had reached a verdict, the courtroom filled quickly. Family members, media representatives, legal observers, and members of the public who'd been following the case all crowded in to hear the outcome. The verdict was read, guilty. John Bernard Feit was convicted of the murder of Irene Garza. The courtroom erupted in emotion. Tears from Garza family members, gasps from observers, and perhaps a sense of profound relief that after nearly 6 decades, justice had finally been served. Feit himself showed little reaction, sitting quietly as the verdict was announced. His attorneys immediately began discussing appeals, but for the moment, the jury had spoken and they had found Feit guilty of a crime committed 57 years earlier. The sentencing phase followed, where the jury would determine what punishment Feit should receive. In Texas, Murder convictions can result in sentences ranging from 5 years to life in prison. The prosecution argued for a substantial sentence, emphasizing the brutality of the crime, the fact that Feit had evaded justice for decades, and the need to send a message that accountability will come eventually even if it takes decades. The defense argued for leniency given Feit's age and health issues, suggesting that even a relatively short sentence would effectively be a life sentence for an 85-year-old man in poor health. The jury ultimately sentenced Feit to life in prison, with the possibility of parole after serving a certain portion of the sentence. For the Garza family, the conviction and sentence represented a bittersweet victory. Justice had finally come, but it had come far too late for Irene's parents, who had died without seeing their daughter's killer held accountable. It had come after 57 years of pain, frustration, and the constant reminder that the man who'd killed their loved one was living freely while Irene remained in her grave. Family members spoke to media after the verdict, expressing relief and gratitude that Feit had finally been convicted, but also acknowledging that no verdict could bring Irene back or truly compensate for what had been taken from them. They spoke about Irene not as a victim or a cold case file, but as a person, a sister, an aunt, a friend, a teacher, a young woman whose life had mattered and who deserved to be remembered for who she was, not just for how she died. John Feit was taken into custody to begin serving his sentence. The elderly man who'd spent decades living as a free citizen, who'd married and raised a family, who'd worked and retired, and lived what appeared from the outside to be a normal life, would now spend his final days in prison. On February 12, 2020, Feit died of natural causes while incarcerated. He was 87 years old. His death came just 3 years after his conviction, meaning he served only a fraction of the life sentence he'd received. Some might see his quick death as him escaping the full measure of justice he deserved. Others might see it as a kind of cosmic justice. He finally faced accountability for his crime, even if only briefly, before death claimed him. The case of Irene Garza and the conviction of John Feit raises profound questions about justice, institutions, and the passage of time. How many victims of clergy abuse suffered in silence because the church prioritized its reputation over accountability? How many cases went unprosecuted because the cultural reverence for religious institutions made juries unwilling to believe accusations against priests? What does it mean for justice to come 57 years late, when the victim's parents have died without seeing it, when the defendant is elderly and near death, when the community that was devastated by the crime has changed almost beyond recognition? These are questions without easy answers, but they're questions that the Garza case forces us to confront. The case also stands as a testament to persistence. The investigators who kept the file active for decades, who never stopped believing they knew who killed Irene Garza even when prosecution seemed impossible. The family members who never gave up seeking justice, who kept Irene's memory alive and kept pushing authorities to pursue the case. The witnesses like Dale Tacheny who eventually found the courage to break silence and provide testimony that proved crucial to securing a conviction. And perhaps most importantly, Irene herself, her memory, her dignity, the injustice of her stolen life. All of these things demanded that the case never be forgotten, that the search for justice continue no matter how long it took. Irene Garza's murder became the oldest cold case ever solved in American history when John Feit was convicted in 2017. That distinction is remarkable from a legal and investigative standpoint, demonstrating that even decades-old cases can potentially be prosecuted successfully if enough evidence remains, and if prosecutors are willing to undertake the enormous challenge of trying ancient crimes. But beyond the legal milestone, Irene's case is a human story about a life stolen, a family shattered, a community scarred, and a justice system that took far too long, but ultimately did provide some measure of accountability. Today, Sacred Heart Church still stands in McAllen, still serving its parish community. The building has been renovated over the years. The confessional booths where Irene met her fate have likely been replaced or reconfigured, and most current parishioners probably know the story of what happened there in 1960 only as history, if they know it at all. But for those who remember, for the remaining Garza family members, for investigators who worked the case, the church will forever be marked by what occurred there on Holy Saturday, 1960. Irene Garza's grave in a McAllen cemetery bears witness to a life that should have been so much longer, so much fuller. She should have celebrated her 26th birthday, her 30th, her 50th, her 80th. She should have married, had children and grandchildren, continued teaching and inspiring students for decades, grown old surrounded by loved ones. Instead, her life ended at 25, stolen by someone she trusted implicitly, someone who used his position of religious authority to gain access to a vulnerable victim, someone who then evaded justice for over half a century. But her story doesn't end with her death, because the fight for justice continued, the search for truth persisted, and ultimately, the legal system, flawed and delayed as it was, did provide some measure of accountability. That's cold comfort, perhaps, but it's more than many victims of cold cases ever receive, and it stands as proof that sometimes, if people refuse to give up, justice can come even after the longest wait imaginable.